Oh, well, hello there. Thank you for joining us. It's Sunday, the day before Columbus Day, and I have an all-star cast, an ensemble of history YouTubers here today to talk about Christopher Columbus, his legacy, the controversy to this day that surrounds him. We have a discussion about Columbus, and we will start out talking about him, but we could end up talking about all kinds of stuff. So we're going to be with you a couple hours today. First of all, we're going to do introductions, and then we'll kind of dive in. So you guys all know me because this is the Mr. Beat channel. So I'm going to start by taking it over to Donald, who has the channel Cogito. So go ahead.
Hi, so I'm Donald. I run Cogito, where I kind of release animated history videos, or as my best troll ever has called them, fat children dressed up in historical clothing. And I also release a video every week over on Kings and Generals.
Okay, and Jack?
Hello, my name is Jack Rackham. I make sort of silly animated biographies. I used to have a schedule, and that's totally gone, so I'm on hiatus now.
All right, and Knowing Better?
Oh, I didn't know you were coming to me. Hi, I'm Knowing Better. I do social studies topics, so history, government, psychology. I recently started religion. I don't know if I'm going to continue with that, but we'll see. Every 2 weeks or so. So, yeah.
All righty then. Now we got M.Laser.
Oh yeah, hello. My name is M.Laser. I make also YouTube videos. They're kind of animated, I guess. They talk about, I have a series on the history of cities, but I also do history of basically anything I feel like doing. And it's a great time. I have a great time making them and responding to the comments. And yeah, come check me out.
Right on. And we got Stefan.
Hey, yeah, I'm Stefan. I'm the baby of this group. I make history videos, all sorts of stuff, lots of different periods, lots of different topics, and probably in the future I'm going to be doing a lot on prehistory and the Stone Age, because that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. That and live streams with Mr. Beat, so and all of you guys. So
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, check it out.
So like two of the members here are on the Pacific Coast, and so they had to get up nice and early this Sunday morning, and so I apologize. Also had to make Knowing Better get up pretty early. He's in the Rocky Mountains, and I'm here in Kansas. I get up early every day anyway because I have little kids. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Christopher Columbus is the starting point here, and really I think we'll spend a lot of time looking at him because he is. And I know the cynical historian will not like me saying this because he doesn't like superlatives, but Christopher Columbus is one of the most important figures in human history. Okay, let's just get that established. And so obviously there's going to be a lot of baggage tied to him. There's going to be a lot of opinions swirling around, especially when you look at the impact of what he did. So I guess we're going to start with kind of the first question I have for all of you. Maybe we could start with the same order that we started for introductions, but yeah, no, maybe we should start with what we talked about before. I'm totally already going off script. Knowing Better has a phenomenal video about the legacy of Christopher Columbus, and it's a more nuanced view. And a lot of times when people try to turn Columbus into a villain, or even just straight up completely downplay the fact that he did bad things, saying that, that why are you even questioning that he has a holiday? There's always gray area between that gets left out. So that video kind of looks at all that. So maybe Knowing Better, start out with why you decided to make the video and I guess kind of the reactions to it.
Sorry, still waking up. The reactions to it have been pretty positive. I would say that was my why did I make the video? There are very few historical figures that I can name that have had so much baggage added onto them, incorrectly, I think. He's become kind of a composite character of everything bad about colonialism. Just like stuff that other people did are attributed to him, whether it is, I mean, not a lot of people know the name De Ovando unless you watch the video. But stuff he did, Cortez, the Pilgrims, all of that kind of gets tagged onto Columbus, even though he died in 1506. He was in the New World for, well, 14 years, but in truth, he was only in the New World for like 4 or 5. He had a rather small impact, an important impact for sure, and the first that matters. But he didn't have like the biggest impact. He's not the most evil person. He's definitely, I don't think he's a hero. So there's that part, and I try to make that clear in the video. I don't think he should have a holiday in the United States, considering he had very little to do with the United States. But he's also not Hitler. He's, that's the standard all evil people are held up to. And he didn't kill millions of people. He did kill like tens of thousands. It's not good. Certainly isn't good. But he didn't genocide 2 whole continents as many people attribute to him. That happened over centuries afterwards. So it's not like he showed up and just massacred everybody. He certainly did have an impact on the Taino people in Hispaniola, but when it comes to, say, Plains Indians, I had that video in my video, where Sioux people saying F Columbus. Like, what did he do to you other than find an island several thousand miles away? He's just this Frankenstein's monster villain for all of Native American history. So that's kind of why I made the video. I had seen several rather big names. Adam Ruins Everything, Cracked, several times Cracked actually. College Humor does some stuff that just kind of repeat various myths that I knew to be false from my liberal college education. And so when I kept seeing those, I was like, you know what, someone should make a video about that. So I did. And there.
We've all seen the video. It's pretty darn good, and I told you it would be a hit. I told you. Let's start with Donald. What are your thoughts about the video, about the legacy of Columbus?
Well, like the video is pretty good because I like the part of the video where like you kind of tear down Adam Ruins Everything and Cracked, because they kind of swung the pendulum the other way. Like in the United States, Christopher Columbus is kind of famous for he discovered the world was round and it wasn't flat, and he sailed over the ocean, and then he found America, and then it was all over. And then Adam Ruins Everything and Crack kind of took this kind of pop history thing and they twisted it, and we're like, no, he didn't do that. He's actually the worst monster in the entire world. He like enslaved all the people and he killed everyone. And it's like, no, Christopher Columbus is like a guy miscalculates how big the earth is, accidentally gets lost and lands in Hispaniola, enslaves a lot of people there and kills a lot of people there, but like not an extraordinary amount for people that landed in the Americas from Europe. Like he's not very high up on the scoreboard. But I think the reason like that he gets the legacy of being like the worst one is because he has a day. because like on Columbus Day, like in a lot of schools, they only focus on Columbus, and so when people leave school, they're like, "Ah, Columbus did the colonialism," and then like that's where like you have that video of like the Lakota Sioux people, and they're just sticking up the middle finger at Columbus because yeah, they need to like put anger on someone, and he's like the most visible face.
He's basically the scapegoat.
Columbus is a massive twerp, but like he's not the worst one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't like him. Like I really, really don't like him.
I mean, but
Like,
there's not very many people in world history to like. So
yeah, there's a few. But, like, Columbus is like go down the list. Cortez is worse, and the governor of Hispaniola after Cortez is worse, but he shouldn't be like the scapegoat for colonialism. But he also shouldn't have a day because it's horrible for everyone.
I think if I could interject, I think that's one of the biggest problems when it comes to looking at historical figures is that everyone it is very black and white. You can't say like we're all gonna catch flack for saying stuff like, well, Columbus wasn't that bad, because it's either he's bad or he's good. There is no, while we all know there's an in-between, there's like certain people that you're required to have a black or white opinion on. Like, I certainly hope everyone here has an evil opinion of like Hitler or Stalin. There's not much gray area when it comes to those people. But, and I wasn't in the video, I wasn't trying to like argue that Columbus was good. It was just, he's bad, but he's not like the extreme. He's, you know, maybe a dark gray. But we seem to have this need, you know, and it's even in modern politics. People will just, is this person good or bad? And that's it. There's no, well, so.
Well, yeah, he's definitely like right in the middle of the gray area. Like he's slightly like for his time, he wasn't like awful, but like wasn't good either.
anyone else want to step in?
I also wanted to add, this is kind of a side note, but I thought of it when Cookie said that people in America think Columbus proved the world was round. And I want to say this is such a, like every time you see some of the history misconceptions on YouTube or anywhere on internet, it's always that one thing that Columbus didn't prove the world was round. And it's honestly annoying me at this point when I see it because it's everywhere. And I'm like, don't people at this point know that that's not a thing? Like, why is it showing up everywhere?
Between that and Napoleon being short, like everywhere, every time.
Well, I think the main problem is like they teach it in primary school. Like you learn about Columbus like when you're like 7. So it's definitely pretty simple.
They teach you that in primary school, and then, you know, a few years later, they're like, all right, so everything we taught you in elementary school about this was wrong. Here's why. And they repeat that for the next few years.
That's every subject, though. Do you remember in math when you couldn't do 2 minus 5? You just can't do it. Just can't. And then a few years later, you find out about negative numbers, and you're like, my whole life is a lie. What is this? And I think it's because
can't do 2 minus 5.
You know, when you're a kid, you can't understand these like abstract concepts, so they have to teach it to you in a very simple way. So you can't do 2 minus 5. And Columbus, okay, more people complain about Columbus didn't actually figure out that the world is round than people say that like he didn't. Like, I think that myth just persists for the sake of keeping it so that people have something to talk about.
People like to debunk it.
Yeah, I don't know anyone who's like, actually, Columbus did prove the world is round. I don't. Although, can we agree that perhaps he is the first person to put it into practice somewhat? Everyone thought that you just couldn't make that journey because it was too big. So he actually tried it and succeeded semi sort of.
Well, speaking of that, if I can interject, one thing knowing better that your video did was dispel a myth that I had. You know, growing up in Europe, we don't spend a lot of time studying Christopher Columbus, especially in England. And I had thought that he had tried to go around the bottom of Africa to reach India, and that he had been blown off course. At least that's how I felt it was presented to me, and I never looked into it. But he was actually sailing in the right direction, and you know, I didn't give him credit as a navigator that he perhaps deserves. And it's like in the Adam Ruins Everything video, they really portray him as a buffoon, and that was sort of the impression that I had, that he had really taken a wrong turn without looking into it. You know, as we've said, you don't cover these things in the primary school in England in a lot of detail. But
the idiot buffoon factor, I think, is tacked on when the evil angle doesn't work. Maybe this is a racist thing, but a lot of white people don't necessarily when you hear that Columbus killed 10,000 native people, you're kind of like, yeah, that happened. Like it's not a, doesn't affect you quite as much. So then they have to put on the he thought the world was shaped like a pear with a nipple on top. Like, what? Like, it just way out of left field stuff to make him also sound like an idiot, so that you, if you weren't affected by the evilness, you'll still not like him.
And I think for things like Cracked and Adam Ruins Everything, like it's just so much easier to make like a compelling story if you just, you know, if you have such a you know, an evil and stupid character to work with, instead of just presenting, you know, things the way they are.
And also, if you like, I don't know, they find that pear stuff, or they make up other things to portray him as a buffoon, but there are like things he actually did which weren't so smart. He was a terrible administrator, and he knew stuff. He knew sailing. He was quite cunning when it came to like person-to-person interactions with the locals and also with his crew. But when it came to administrating Hispaniola, or when it came to like establishing a colony, he was not good. His colony, after when La Navidad went terrible, his colony after that was the northern side of today Dominican Republic, which was a terrible area because it was too windy for a permanent port. And he knew, like, I don't know if he knew it or not, but there's accounts of people telling him like this is not a good area, and the only reason why he stayed there was because he found some little remnants of gold, even though it was a terrible area to stay. And it eventually it came to bite him in the ass. Sorry, because it was prone to hurricanes, that area. And there's like points like this you can point to, being like, oh look, he was bad at this stuff. He couldn't administrate stuff. He couldn't make some decisions which were told to him that they were bad, and he has to make something. He has to change something. So there are accounts where you could say he's a buffoon in certain areas, but I feel like because you cannot say that as a whole that he's a buffoon, because he had some good traits, I feel like that's the problem, and that's why people don't actually use those true bad things he did and bad decisions.
Well, I think Columbus is a great example of how there's a very fine line between foolishness and bravery. You know, like a lot of times the people that do the most brave things in history, are they doing them because they're brave, or just because they just don't know any better? Like, shout out to knowing better. So like, I mean, ignorance, I think, drives a lot of sometimes innovation and just like pushing the envelope. What do you guys think about that notion?
Well, the reason he thought that he was going to get to Asia was because he wasn't actually brave. Well, maybe he was, obviously he was a little brave, went in the ocean, but like he left and sailed towards Japan, like Japangu, or what was supposed to be Japan, because he thought it was much closer than it was. So he was confident that he was going to hit Japan. And the reason he was confident he's going to hit Japan because he took the circumference of the earth from an Arabic geographer, but he forgot to convert the Arabic mile into an Italian mile, and the Arabic mile is much larger. So he underestimated the size of the Atlantic Ocean by like a few thousand kilometers. So he was certain he was going to get to Japan within 4 or 5 weeks.
I show in my video, I show the Toscanelli map that he was using. And it wasn't just Toscanelli. There was a few others that looked very similar, the Erdapfel and stuff like that, which there was no Pacific Ocean or Atlantic Ocean. It was just the ocean, the ocean sea, rather, and it was just one. And they thought that the Atlantic was bigger or that the Pacific was smaller. However you want to justify it in your head, they thought that the ocean was a lot smaller and that Japan was much further east than it is. And all those maps are based off of Marco Polo, which he was a real guy, but we all think of him as like just this fictional person who did in fact make up stories about where he went. So all of these maps were based off of this one guy who claims to have gone to Japan, where he said that the floor of the palace was covered with 2 inches of gold and stuff like that, which is why people like Columbus wanted to get there, because apparently they just had so much gold that it was everywhere, based off of the rather tall tales of Marco Polo. But the placement of Japan and how far east China extended and all of that, that was accepted fact when Columbus set sail. So if it was Columbus or anyone else, they would have been aiming for the same spot, more or less.
Yeah.
Well, what about the perception of Columbus? I think I'm looking at some of the comments. One of the comments wanted to kind of share from Boner. Oh, I'm not going to say his full name because I don't think it's school appropriate. But this person says, problems with a historical figure who's had a legend built around them is that if someone wants to dispel the legend, it becomes partisan. People can't just be wrong. They have to be ironically wrong. That kind of got me thinking about how like the politics that kind of surrounds the talking about Columbus, even today, all these years later, and then how people use it for virtue signaling and stuff like that. What do you think about like just the because I noticed that when I watched the Cracked video and Adam Ruins Everything, like you know, like see how much better we are because we see these flaws about Columbus, you know? So how is it tied to people's identity today, like when we have discussions about Columbus?
Well, if I can say quickly, at my job, I've been talking about these past few days, and we were talking about whether it's Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, and I don't want to jump the chat forward too much, but at my job, one of my managers preferred to keep it Columbus Day because they thought it was more patriotic. And considering his connection to the USA is almost non-existent, I found that reaction really surprising.
Oh, that's
what does it affect someone's patriotism or not over here in America? You know, he fought and sailed for the Spanish monarchy hundreds of years before the USA was even a thing, before they even had this concept of a USA. So I thought it was really interesting how they had tied it to their view of patriotism in America.
It's kind of ironic because Indigenous people are more American than Columbus is.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. But yeah, you know, that's tied to their view of America and what it means to be American to them, I guess. This journey from Europe to America, perhaps, I'm not sure.
The reason it gets tied to politics is because your opinion of Columbus is usually fairly indicative of your opinion of Native Americans. So if you're like, hey, Columbus was a hero, like the background connotation of that is that the Indians were savages or whatever term you want to put in there. So that's kind of why if I say Columbus wasn't that bad, people are hearing in the background that Native Americans don't deserve whatever it is that they deserve. So I think that's why it gets tied to the politics aspect of it. And then you had mentioned Indigenous Peoples Day. I say this in the end of my video. I disagree with them name swapping the holiday for the simple fact that it will always be Columbus Day if they do that. If they want to get rid of Columbus Day, then get rid of Columbus Day. I'm fine with that. I have no connection to that. I don't care. And then if they want to make Indigenous Peoples Day, then let's do that also. But if you just name swap it, then there's always going to be this battle of it should be Columbus Day. And in 50 years, there's going to be a Today I Learned post. Indigenous Peoples Day used to be Columbus Day. Like, it's always going to have that. So
Well, you'd be
just
surprised. Like, I think the United States is the last, or one of the last American countries that celebrates Columbus Day. It's Race Day or Indigenous Peoples Day in every other American nation. So I think if you change it really quickly, like, I think the problem with the United States is that in some places it is Columbus Day, and other places it's Indigenous Peoples Day, and the change kind of happens like in little pockets. But I think with the change overnight, and then you just teach Indigenous Peoples Day on the 8th of October or the 12th, whenever it is, like the change will happen pretty fast. Like, it takes one generation and people will kind of forget about it.
I'm such a typical American. I didn't even know that. Gosh, this is embarrassing.
I think like Brazil is the only one that has like a day dedicated to an explorer, but it's not Columbus. It's the one who discovered Brazil.
I thought didn't like Spain and Italy still have some sort of Columbus Day?
Italy does Columbus Day, and Spain has Spain Day.
Oh, Spain Day.
Yes.
Close enough.
I remember when I lived in Spain, I got the day off. It was great.
Well, you don't get the day off everywhere in the United States. It's only certain states. You don't get it off in Kansas, which is why we couldn't do this live stream tomorrow.
You don't get it off in Oregon either, but fortunately I work in the financial industry, so they follow federal holidays. So I'm off, but my wife goes to work.
Speaking of days off, I mean, imagine if, like, I've heard the argument, like President Obama, when he was in office, he suggested that they get rid of Columbus Day and replace it with a day off for Election Day. Like, that way people have more opportunities to vote. I mean, so thinking about, the fact that I think that when people get a day off across an entire country for this one person, I mean, I think, sure, a lot of times they lose the meaning of the day anyway. Like, think about Labor Day. How many people, oh yeah, that's barbecue day. Yeah, like, no, they don't know about like what went into that the history of that day. But I think when you do have a day off or something, like, I think it does hold a little bit more meaning. So maybe that's another reason why a lot of people are just like, man, just get rid of it.
Yeah. They're probably scared of losing a public holiday. That was one of my other managers' attitudes. You know, it's Columbus Day or back to work. You know, you unpatriotic green card holder. Why did I hire you? You get Columbus Day off or you go to work. But
I think Indigenous Peoples Day could work though. So like, you swap it to Indigenous Peoples Day, it's like, I'm not sure what the holidays are in the United States, but like, is there a day to celebrate like Native American culture or indigenous cultures? Or
no, it's Columbus
Not
Day.
that I know
pretty
of.
much.
Yeah.
It's
so if you just change it to Indigenous Peoples Day, like maybe you could push that in schools where people learn for one day of the year about indigenous cultures, like in the area they're from.
I mean, we certainly learn about indigenous cultures in school regularly, but there is no day to do it. It's
But,
turned into Columbus Day. I mean, that's what they do on Columbus Day now, is because it's, the Indigenous Peoples Day swap. So
What I wonder is how much is Columbus taught in school, like in America? Since you have Columbus Day, I wonder how deep you go on him as a person in school, or is it just more like, oh yeah, he sailed here, he found out, that's about it?
I will tell you, since I do teach high school social studies, in elementary school, students do learn about Columbus. There's few historical figures that they actually learn about in elementary school. You got George Washington, you've got Abraham Lincoln, you've got maybe Sacagawea, so they try to get a few women in there. But yeah, Christopher Columbus, you learn about him early on. My daughter's in 2nd grade; she's already been introduced to him. But I think, and when we talk about high school, a lot of people make assumptions that it's still like it was when they were in high school. It's actually most of the teachers that I've worked with and the way I teach Columbus is similar to Knowing Better's video. It's like it's a great opportunity to have a Socratic seminar or maybe even a debate, but look at different points of view and look at different perceptions. And but we spend a considerable amount of time. I mean, we actually spend just as much time, if not more time, on the Columbian Exchange, looking at the impact of that, because I mean, I teach economics as well. I spend a couple days just on that as well, just looking at how that revolutionized trade around the world, and how, there was a lot of positive, but then looking at the 90% of Native Americans wiped out due to disease. But yeah, I think it'd be a little bit foolish to not spend much time on Columbus. I mean, we try not to spend too much time on just like one person, but looking at the impact of one person more is what it's not like we spend like a full week at like all the little details about Columbus's life. Like, oh, here's where he grew up and, all his life in Italy. No, we looked at the impact of what happened after him.
But maybe that could be part of the reason why people accredit so much of the bad stuff that happened with colonialism to Columbus, because he's the major figure they learn about when it comes to colonialism. So, and as you said, you don't learn about many major figures at that point, and Columbus is one of them. And since he's one of the ones connected to colonialism, they just accredit it all to him, and that's why he ends up in America being portrayed by some people as being just absolutely awful because he brought all of this stuff.
You got to have a scapegoat. You got to have one. I mean, he is the turning point, right? I mean, sure, there's Leif Erikson before him, but come on now, Columbus. He was the first. Like, he was the first to bring back all that to the rest of Europe, and if it wasn't Columbus, it would have been somebody else. Maybe even his brother. Who knows? Like, so I think it could have. We could be talking about Cortez Day, like, goodness, that would be a little bit more.
That'd be pretty rough.
And I guess another thing people don't forget about, we talk about Columbus a lot, but his brother was very influential in him even starting the voyage. And when they were trying to find funding and they went to Castile and Portugal and even England to find funding, his brother was there next to him trying to help him find this funding. And yes, Columbus is the one we talk about, but we never really talk about the people around him that made it all possible, like his brother.
I'll be honest. I didn't even know he had a brother that was involved in all that.
Yeah, I actually I was sitting here smiling because yesterday I opened up my script in order to find where I had said certain things, and there were whole sections about his brother that I just cut out because I was like, this is going to get too confusing. People are going to be like, oh, how many Columbuses were there? I just
There was four.
Like,
He had three brothers.
well, there was the two, Columbus and his brother, and then his son Diego, and they all kind of get melded into one person when you're telling the story. So it's I just thought of this. It's semi-tangent, but it's kind of like Moses. I don't know how many of you are like religious scholars or whatever. But Moses wasn't the one who said, "Let my people go." It was his brother, Aaron. Like the whole time, it's him and his brother, but we only know Moses. So Columbus is kind of the same way. Like he's the guy. His family members,
Yeah, well, his brother started Santo Domingo, so that's a pretty big deal. Like the first permanent Spanish colony, but nobody knows that. Like,
Poor Dave
Yeah.
Columbus, lost to history.
some of these are minor details, though, and that's kind of why I cut it out. He started a fort, and like, yeah, but is that really worth dedicating a lot of time to? And maybe that's why Columbus has become the scapegoat for everything else. I'm not. I think when it comes to people like Adam Ruins Everything and Cracked and whoever else, they do it to be funny. Also, like they kind of turn it up to 11, and then the next person who's basing their information off of Adam or whoever before also turns it up to 11. So then it just gets bigger and bigger. To here we are 500 years after Columbus, and we have this huge image of him. A few of you probably saw my tweets yesterday because on Reddit, one of the top r/funny things was a video of a guy walking into someone's living room saying, "I live here now," and he throws a jacket to someone, and the guy is holding the jacket, and he says, "That might have smallpox on it." And like that Columbus never did the smallpox blankets thing. In fact, as Mr. Beat replied to one of my tweets saying this, we only know of like the one time that happened. I'm sure it happened more times. Like,
yeah,
I'm positive it did, but it didn't happen for 200, 250 years later. But it still gets attached to Columbus for some reason.
everything gets attached to Columbus, like we were saying.
Columbus, smallpox didn't even appear in like Hispaniola or the Caribbean until Columbus was like dead, like 25 years. Took a while for it to get over. So, like saying that he somehow magically had smallpox blankets that he just like.
Yeah, he came over prepared, brought the smallpox blankets with him, of course.
Yeah.
And I guess also lots of what people also don't look at when they look at historical figures, but Columbus, for example, is the motivation for the people. So they're like, okay, Columbus came, and when he was governor of Hispaniola, he cut off people's hands if they didn't bring him gold. That is, people always say it. It's very well known. But that's about where it ends, and people don't really look at why he did it. And there's a good reason why he did it, and that's because having expeditions into the New World wasn't cheap, and he had investors and he had people he had to pay back, and he was trying to send slaves back, but many of them wouldn't survive the voyage. So he basically implemented these measures that were drastic, and they were drastic for the reason that he needed to pay his investors back. And that is why that is why the people that were under him, not just the Taino people, but also some of the Spanish, were treated badly by Columbus because he was forced by this outside pressure to put pressure on them because he needed to pay them back.
Well, he also got 1/10 of all the gold. So like,
Well,
he had, like, it was a kind of a greedy thing.
That too, yes.
He got 1/10 of everything he sent back, so he was like desperate to get as much as possible.
That too, yes.
Like the thing is, one of the main things that he did is actually bad. That like it's kind of too complicated to teach in schools. That he brought the weird encomienda system from Spain and brought it over to the Caribbean and morphed it into this like weird, everyone's a slave but not a slave because I don't own you, I own your soul kind of thing. That then got exported to the North and South America. So like he wasn't bad. Like his worst thing he did wasn't like pillage and kill everyone. Is that he brought in this weird system that because it transformed from a feudal system in Spain to a weird work people to death in the mines in South America system, was probably the most lasting thing he actually did. Which,
and also he wasn't like when he brought it, that system, it evolved as everything does, and there were people that changed it and there were people that adjusted it. So it wasn't just him, he brought it in and it was complete, and that's how it was used for hundreds of years. No, not at all. But people accredit that system just to him, even though it wasn't him. There was like adaptations and involvement of the system and changes by various people for worse or for better.
That's one of the things I pick on the Wikipedia article for Columbus. I pick on it all the time. In the first paragraph, it says he started the transatlantic slave trade, which really bothers me, because then you click on transatlantic slave trade and it brings you to the article where it says it started in 1516 by Nicholas de Ovando, which is 10 years after Columbus died. So he didn't start it, and it takes a single click to debunk that. And someone that we haven't mentioned yet, Bartolome De Las Casas, who's the source everyone cites to say Columbus was awful. He was the one who really started the transatlantic slave trade by saying, we're treating the native people terribly, we should stop this by bringing those black people from that other continent over here. And so he's the one who started that. He later on was like, oh, that was probably a bad idea, but that doesn't take it back. Like, yeah.
Isn't he the one who like came up with the idea of race? Or was that Columbus? Or I don't know who
The
like
idea of race has been around humanity for a long time.
Well, no, but it wasn't really mainstream until post Columbus. I know that much. Like where, we're gonna have a hierarchy strictly based on different races of people.
that's the encomienda system.
I would say it was mainstream wherever there were quote unquote races intermingling, because that's where you would use it the most. So if you were in Norway, it wouldn't be mainstream at all, because it would just be the same amount, same people. Same in, I don't know, Congo, it would be the same people. But when you started to have more and more people of quote unquote different races intermingling in the Americas, that's where it started to be more prominent. But I would say the idea of race has always been there throughout the history of humankind.
You normally was more divided. Like if you ask like an ancient Greek, like who he has more in common with, like you'd be surprised. They have multiple races within races, and there's barbarians and people that speak Greek.
Yeah, there's
I would agree that it's definitely got more defined over time, but I would also say that it probably has been, at least in the back of people's mind, for as long as we were able to recognize differences between people. So
well, yeah, what I meant was the word race, like the way, like you were saying, how it was more defined. Obviously, people had differences in us versus them since the first human beings existed, but yeah, like I think for them to basically make it systematic, like the encomienda system, yeah, like we do teach about that. At least we do in AP US history. So I think a lot of students do get confused about that system compared to the slavery that came later on with the South. Like they're like, well, how is this different than that?
You have to remember that you're not the typical teacher, and your experience may be different from, say, non-YouTuber teachers.
Well, that's right. I am the greatest teacher of all time. So.
I mean, when I was a teacher, I spent half a period talking about Columbus, but there were others in my department who would say all the stuff that I would end up debunking in my class. He started the slave trade. He enslaved the native people, etc. Which I got a lot of. We're talking about encomienda right now, so I'll bring this up. I got a lot of flack in my video for saying that he didn't, that that the people were forced to work, but nobody owned them. So I kind of pulled apart the encomienda peasant system. If we call it that, more English-speaking people might know what we're talking about. Encomienda kind of sounds like this.
It's like a feudal system.
Yeah, it's basically the same as serfdom, really. So they were forced to work, and it certainly sucked, and I feel bad for them. But no one, like, you didn't put Taino people up for auction and sell them to the plantation or mine next door. It
It wasn't chattel slavery.
yeah.
But it's like, it's a very small difference. It's like they didn't own them, but the whole point of the system was that you own their souls, and it's your job to make them Christian. Well, they're too busy in the mine to go to Christian classes, so they never get converted. It was like a weird system that was just like a weird Frankenstein between serfdom and slavery that, like, and in the places, like, you can notice in the places in Latin America where the encomienda system wasn't implemented as heavily, there's like a lot more native people. Like Mexico, the encomienda system didn't work because they just used the Aztec system of tribute, and there's a lot more native people left in Mexico. If you go to Venezuela and Colombia, where it was very heavily used, the numbers kind of plummet.
This is an extreme side note here, but to any AP history students out there watching, I took the AP test and I got a 1, and now I make history videos on YouTube. So
Yeah.
if you
Is one
do
a good or bad?
1 is a bad. That is very bad. So if you feel bad about your AP scores, don't be. You can always change it. And I don't test well, so that was a bad test. But yes, I just wanted to say that. Don't feel bad about your AP scores. If you get them, you can still do history stuff later on.
And make very high quality videos, very well researched videos.
Thank you.
M.Laser does a terrific job. So yeah, screw the AP test, says the AP teacher.
This is the AP teacher. Yeah.
The chat has kind of been nailing the point that the Vikings found America first. So perhaps we could talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I gotten a bit of flack when I made my what happened to the first European colony in the New World video, because everybody always started saying, well, wasn't the first European colony the Vikings? Which, well, yeah, technically, but they didn't do anything. They showed up, stayed a bit, and left, and that's about it. So, like, it is, I guess, a colony, but they didn't capitalize on anything. They didn't do anything. So I don't really take them to account that much. They didn't even tell anyone. Like, nobody knew about America. And they even forgot later on, like, there was this land. So it's like, you can say that, yes, they discovered it first, I guess, but because nothing really happened. It's like that philosophy thing. If the tree falls in the forest and there's no one to see it, it'll make a sound. And I guess this is the same thing.
Could you even consider it a colony, really? Because when I think of a colony, I think of sort of the mother country, whatever it is, sort of extending its power. And it's almost like you've created another state, another region of your country. And, Viking society didn't really function like that. It was much more loosely organized, and they were there for such a short period of time, and really just to get timber, because Greenland, as Knowing Better said in this video, it's not that green.
Yeah, it's like a holiday gone wrong.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, it's debatable even calling it a colony. I would agree with you on that, definitely. And I'd probably rather live in the Caribbean than Nova Scotia, so I'd have sailed with Christopher Columbus anytime. But
Someone's going to take that out of context.
yeah. But I think it's definitely right to say that the Spanish with Christopher Columbus were the first colony, rather than the the Vikings technically set foot here, but as you've said and you all know, it's such a minimal impact.
I wouldn't even call it a colony. It was a winter camp. Like they spent a few months here or there. I try to make a distinction between find and discover. I know it's a kind of a silly semantic argument, but sure, they, well, technically found it second after the natives, but they were the first Europeans to find it, but then they just walked away and never did anything with it. It's like finding buried treasure, walking away, and then the Spanish find it again, and you're like, no, wait, that was us. No, it's gone. Like,
Yeah, the Spanish did something with it.
And it's not even like, oh wait, that was us at that time. It was like centuries later they were like, oh yeah, we were there before the Spanish. So
did that result in any belated territorial claims on the part of Iceland or Norway?
It resulted in lots of Greenlanders and Icelanders being like, yo, we should have this. But
we liked America before it was cool.
Yeah, pretty much. It's resulted in that, basically, nothing else. And there's that whole debate when I did my History of Iceland video, where because Icelanders were settlers from Norway and Greenlanders were settlers from Iceland, and then the people that went to Canada were settlers from Greenland. So there's this weird connection between all of them, and then those people that live there now still argue about it, like who went where, because the Norwegians say like, well, it was us indirectly. And the Icelander says, well, it was us indirectly. And then it's just like a whole connection of like...
And then the Ethiopians say, well, it was us indirectly.
Yeah, like, exactly.
Trying to look at the chat here. You guys see anything that you want to address in the chat, or should we go to another one of our questions?
Let's see.
The only question I have at this, which I saw from chat also, was about the Indigenous Peoples Day, and like to end this maybe conversation, I guess, would be if there was an Indigenous Peoples Day, wouldn't it be better to just proclaim a random date or a different date than Columbus Day and to just end Columbus Day? So you technically have the same amount of holidays still, it's just a different day. So it doesn't end up, like Knowing Better said, the day doesn't end up just being, oh, let's hate on Columbus.
I think like some of the stuff I saw was that they actually wanted to do it on a different day, but because they could easily latch on to the Columbus Day kind of hype and publicity, it was the best day to propose, because that way people would pay more attention to it. If they're able to say, get rid of Columbus, put Indigenous Peoples Day, it created kind of more of a debate.
Yeah, I mean, speaking from Oregon's perspective, it is a different day. It's October 9th is a Indigenous Peoples Day here in Oregon, and they don't celebrate Columbus Day at all. For me personally, I am in favor of switching Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. I think just because I really think the USA could do with something like Indigenous Peoples Day. And this has already got some momentum behind it, that even though, you know, there is the downside of it forever being connected to Christopher Columbus, I think this would be maybe the easiest way to achieve something like Indigenous Peoples Day. And even if it was always connected to Christopher Columbus, I think perhaps it wouldn't hurt to have the ability to also reflect on colonialism and the negatives of colonialism, as well as celebrating the cultures that were here first. So I am dead in favor of Indigenous Peoples Day, swapping it out for Columbus Day personally. But that's my opinion.
I said this earlier. I think it should be a different day. Um, but then we would run into the problem, if we got rid of Columbus Day and put Indigenous Peoples Day in a month where there is no holidays, like August or something, like we could use a few more August holidays maybe. But if we got rid of Columbus Day, then there'll always be like that gap where people semi-celebrate Columbus Day. So I don't know if there is a like a right answer, because if we do switch Columbus Day, if we just name swap it, I think it will still be Columbus Day, because a lot of schools, they turn it into a project where the class will debate or hold mock trials of Columbus or whatever it is. So it's like always going to be a Columbus-centric holiday, I guess, even if we name swap it.
Yeah, I
How
mean,
are you going to cover like 100 different native tribes in a day, unless you only do like your local ones? And I think that people take the path of least resistance. So how do we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day? Well, let's talk about the guy who's known for destroying native peoples. And yeah.
I don't know. I mean, as I said, over here in Oregon, they've gotten rid of it and put Indigenous Peoples Day the day after. And I don't teach in a school here, so I don't really have that side to comment about. But you don't really see anything about Christopher Columbus here. And I think, as you said, which group of Native Americans could you pick? I mean, like you said, probably just your local one, but I think it could be done. I would still be in favor of it. There would always be that connection to some extent, but like you said, it would be the path of least resistance. So,
Hey, Jack, do they celebrate Columbus Day in California? I would imagine it's even more controversial there.
I'm not sure. I'm only in LA for college right now, but I believe they do, because I know at least some local high schools have a day off for Columbus Day.
Did you learn about Columbus quite a bit growing up? Did you get all these myths? And I don't know. I guess I don't know much about where you came from, so maybe.
Yeah, I came from Florida, and we. Huh? Oh, that's right. You're out in Florida too, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm in Florida right now. That's why I was talking.
Yeah, nice place. Yeah, we didn't get a lot about Columbus specifically. It was sort of, I think whenever Columbus was brought up, it was always either in terms of, elementary school, he sailed around the world and found America, or kind of, swinging the pendulum the other way, and talking about how bad he was. But he always shows up just sort of being like representative of colonialism as a whole.
And then what about, I guess, those of you from outside of the United States? So there's that guy. I mean, growing up, what was your experiences in the classroom about Columbus, with Columbus?
For me, in Slovakia, it was basically European history, mainland European history. We didn't even talk about Britain that much. And then there was literally like a sentence, I think, where it was like, oh yeah, in 1492, Columbus sailed to America, and then, oh, let's go back to European history. And then later on, as it starts affecting mainland European history, colonialism, and the Columbian trade and everything, that's when we start hearing more about the Americas. But for us, it was literally, the start was just that one sentence or maybe one paragraph. That's about it.
Yeah, I mean, with Christopher Columbus going to school in Britain, first of all, may I say, Slovakia not learning British history, I am outraged and offended. But yeah, learning about Christopher Columbus would have been done in primary school, elementary school, and it's just a very quickly covered thing. You know, he discovered America, and maybe they'd shy away from that phrase now, and there wasn't really too much time spent on it. In my high school history class in the final year, we did study the American West. And this, I was going to bring this point up with you guys. I feel like in Britain, studying the American West in the last year of high school is perhaps a way to talk about colonialism that isn't very politically sensitive, because we sort of, you know, we're like, look what the Americans did. How should we feel about that? Blah, blah, blah. And there's no discussion, at least when I did history, of what happened in Canada. There's no discussion of the British rule in Africa and Asia, because perhaps that would be too politically sensitive to bring up. I know it's an option in high school history, but certainly was not covered in mine. And I wonder if, because Christopher Columbus has no connection really to the USA, if it sort of fills that same role of talking about colonialism without picking a figure that might be more sensitive. But I'm not sure.
A lot of the stuff that's attributed to Columbus actually did happen in the American West. So that it would be a good replacement, sort of. But I the more I think about it, the more Columbus is like the easiest way to just talk about all of this. And I think that's kind of why he has become that way. You know, for a teacher, you don't want to have to sit there and like write a doctoral dissertation on colonialism to your class of 10-year-olds. You just like, here's this guy who did all these things. Maybe he didn't do all of them, but you know, someone did, so we might as well just talk about it here. So there's a like a generational turnover for teachers, and it's going to take a long time before, like, even if all colleges right now decided we're not going to talk about Columbus anymore, it's going to take 20 or 30 years before the Gen X and millennial teachers stop talking about Columbus. So it would be a long time, I think. But talking about the American West would help with that, and I think we do to a good extent. I mean, most Americans know who Custer was, so it's definitely possible. And the various massacres that took place, maybe not everyone can name more than 2 or 3, but I guess that's why people just stick to Columbus, because it's easy and everyone knows it.
Yeah, well, Ireland we use like Columbus as he's just colonialism. You do one day, there's a paragraph, it says Columbus went to the Queen of Spain. Then you drag a picture of Columbus across the whiteboard from Spain over to America, and then it just says, and then the Incas and the Aztecs and the Mayas collapsed, and then George Washington declared independence. And that was like that issue. And I was like, okay, back to Ireland.
You don't, Kagito, you don't talk about the later voyages of Irish to the Americas?
And during the famine and everything. Actually, the most we focus on the Americas is getting the potato from Peru, and then the going from the immigration from Ireland to the United States and South America.
The potato famine and stuff.
Yeah, it's mostly like it starts off as like this great thing happened. We got a potato. They brought it, and then
thanks Columbus. Thanks Columbus for that potato, because of the Columbian Exchange, right?
Yeah, and then thanks Columbus again, because now the potato's gone, and it was just a whole thing. Yeah. One of the cool things, like one of the things we actually learned in most of the education we did in history was like kind of basic, but one of the cool things we learned was that we got the potato from Peru, and then they sent Peruvian like slaves and workers to islands off the coast of Peru that were made up of bird poo, like guano.
Yes,
And like
yeah, I heard of this.
Europe depended so badly on the guano that they had to send like thousands of shipments of thousands of tons of guano over to Europe to fertilize the fields. And then there was, in that guano, there was the virus that contained the potato famine. So Peru gave us the potato, and then they gave us the famine right after.
Peru giveth and taketh away.
Yeah, Peru gave it.
I didn't know that. That's almost the. Is that the reverse of us not being exposed to diseases from Central America?
Yeah, that's the one thing they got to give us.
Yeah.
There were, I mean, okay, syphilis is
Yeah,
an
that's
American.
one,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really?
Or the Spanish disease, or the French disease, or whatever country you want to
Depending, yeah.
blame. Yep.
There's actually like a pretty like a dramatic example of that, where in a video by Charles C. Mann, he puts up a list of all the diseases that went from Europe to America, and then a list of all the diseases that went from America to Europe, and it's like 12, like a dozen diseases here, and then just syphilis, and a question mark.
I did not know that.
Yeah, well, and syphilis kills very slowly, whereas smallpox and the flu and everything else is, you may have a few weeks at best, whereas syphilis, it's years. So it didn't quite have the same reverse effect.
However, lots of Europeans died in the Caribbean, not due to diseases, but due to stuff like scurvy and other things they didn't really completely understand. And when you look at European colonialism in the Caribbean, like Jamaica, or even the early colonization of Hispaniola, there are lots of cases of Europeans dying not due to indigenous diseases from America, but due to just the fact that they didn't understand how diseases worked or how vitamins worked and other stuff, and they would
Stupidity.
basically, and they would just die from scurvy or malnutrition and other things
The
that they
Pilgrims
could
did
die.
too.
Yeah, that they could die from in Europe as well, but because the Caribbean was like uncultivated, there was like no civilization technically. Oh, sorry, Mayans and Aztecs, but there was no like you couldn't get food as easily and the variety of food as easily as back in Europe. So early colonization Europeans would actually die in high numbers as well.
I think bringing up disease is a really good thing to talk about, actually, because, again, like 90% approximately of Native Americans were wiped out even before the vast majority of Europeans arrived. I mean, the Europeans came over to ghost towns, to, apocalyptic scenes like, holy crap, there was a civilization here, but where are the people? And so I think that gets downplayed. We should be focusing a lot more in history classes looking at the impact of disease. And we always think that, like, we always compare these civilizations, like, oh, how advanced were they compared to this? Like the Mayans, were they actually more advanced than the Europeans? Or, oh no, the Europeans are more advanced. Well, I mean, think about this, like the disease factor often gets ignored in the equation because we can't even compare it without, I mean, it's apples and oranges because of the impact of disease. I mean, there's so much we don't know, we'll never know, because they were gone. Nobody was there.
In North American history, it plays like a huge role because disease, just like the Spanish arrived in the Mississippi, I think it was Hernando Soto, and then like when he left behind disease. And in his reports, he says that there were cities for as far as I could see, you would see lights and enormous cities, and there was like anthills. And then a few years later, another expedition comes, and they describe it like it's fallout. Like it's just ravager bands going around and places that like just no one there, total ghost towns.
That 90% number, I don't think the vast majority of people understand how fast it happened. It was 90% by 1600. So 100 years after Columbus first set foot, 90% of the people were gone. Even Plains Indians and Pacific Northwest Indians who had never even seen a white person, 90% of them were gone before any of that. Before the first colony was set up in North America, that would later become the United States anyway, 90% were gone. It spread from tribe to tribe. So it didn't necessarily require European contact. It would just be tribes wiped out 90% before anyone else had even arrived. So that, like Mr. B had said, the European colonists would show up to just, like he said, ghost towns or just completely empty land. They later said that, you know, this was divine right or whatever, which, okay, but yeah, this happened mostly by accident, and it would have happened almost regardless of who showed up first.
Exactly.
Even if I said this in the video, even if a Chinese explorer had come the other way, it just would have, you know, spread west to east instead. It would have happened regardless, and I'm not sure, you know, if we had waited 500 years until we had vaccinations, I think the result may have still been quite similar.
I think it would have been lower though. It was like kind of
I mean,
exacerbated. It would have been like 60%, I think.
It still would have been terrible, yes.
Because it was like the reason a lot of them died was because they were being grouped together. Like in the Aztec Empire, the disease didn't start until well after the Spanish were already in the main city, and then they attacked the cities around it, and hundreds of thousands of people like became refugees in Tenochtitlan, and then smallpox broke out and wiped out 90% of the people.
That's a good point to bring up.
When you put a lot of pressure, it was a lot of pressure was being applied to them. So people were being moved around, like communities were broken up, and so disease was able to spread much faster. But yeah, it still would have been like 60, 70%. But it's not like there was like virgin soil that disease just came into and hid away.
Yeah, I think there's although it's true how devastating the disease was, there's a danger in some respect, perhaps, with focusing too much on it, because we all love history, and you know we understand that there's a shade of gray. There's not a lot of time in a curriculum to cover it, and you know, without that appreciation of other factors, it might sort of take away from the actions of the people who did arrive here. And I mean, here I know most about the Pacific Northwest because that's where I live at the moment. When the Lewis and Clark expedition arrived here in 1806, just in the area of the Columbia River where I live now around Portland, there was probably still at least 10,000 people that lived here. You know, there's 18 villages that they recorded, and estimated populations around about 1,500 to 1,000. So it still was reasonably. I know it's devastating, but you know, you get the point I'm trying to make, that if we focus on the disease, there might not be enough time to focus on the actions of people, and that's giving kids a chance to reflect on that is probably one of the best reasons they can learn history, if you know what I mean. The best reasons to study it.
I feel like there's only.
Go ahead.
I feel like there's only so much you can say about disease in history too. Whereas, like, you know, with people, there's all kinds of like who was involved and what were their motivations and what were the impacts. With disease, it's sort of like all you can really say is it happened and it killed 90% of the population, and that was that.
I was going to say, like, we basically just covered it in, I don't know, less than 5 minutes. I wouldn't say that it would take too much time away. What I would like to kind of focus in on is we have this here, at least here in America, when we're talking about Columbus or Cortez or the disease and everything else, we view Native Americans as one monolithic culture, when these are two continents. You know, it's similar to saying Europe and Africa are all one people. Like it's way bigger and it stretches thousands of miles, and there were tribes that hated each other just like there are in Europe, and I mean, we'd call them countries, but it's basically the same thing, where people, they certainly wouldn't all view themselves as one people. So when we say when I said in my video that they didn't have domesticated animals, which is true, aside from llamas and guinea pigs, there were people who were like, actually, Tenochtitlan had X amount of people. And it's like, yeah, when looking at North and South America, you're right. Tenochtitlan had a lot of people when for thousands of miles in every other direction, there weren't really. They didn't have advanced cities because you can't without domesticated animals. And there weren't any available. CGP Grey did a great video about that, where it's just
Oop, there we go.
the available animals there in the Americas for domestication just weren't there. They didn't have horses and cows and stuff like that to domesticate, to share diseases with, like Europeans and Asians and everyone else did. Most of the diseases that wiped out 90% of the population, like smallpox, comes from cows. Influenza comes from chickens and pigs and stuff. Like all of these come from other animals that just didn't exist in the Americas for them to have shared the diseases with. So I think we downplay the fact that there just weren't these animals for them to interact with and build a civilization with. It's not because they were stupid and primitive or any of that. It's just I made a video game joke here. I said they had a difficult spawn location. If you've ever played like Civilization or StarCraft or any of those games, and you start off somewhere that just doesn't have the resources, you can only get so far. And without horses and cows and pigs and all that, you just can't have a big city to the scale that existed in Europe and China and stuff.
Thank you, Columbus, for the horses.
Well, yeah. The biggest,
that's a big misconception. I mean, I'm sure we all know, but a lot of viewers don't know that they didn't have horses until the Spanish in, I don't know, 16 something, just turned them loose.
It was a few decades. Was it that long? Yeah, I knew it was a few decades at least. I'm sorry, we cut somebody off. Who was going to say something?
I was saying, well, the other reason like Tenochtitlan got to be so big was because it was on the water, so they didn't need wheels or horses because they could just like use boats. So like I made a lot of videos about the Aztecs, and one of the main criticisms of the Aztecs or any kind of American people is they don't have the wheel. And well, obviously not, because in Mexico the biggest animal you can domesticate is a turkey. And if you see a turkey pull a carriage, it's not going to work. Or a llama, like you can't make a llama pull a carriage. He's going to spit at you.
I don't know if I was looking at the chat just now. With the states that did form cities, particularly in Central America, and I think there's another famous example from Mississippi off the top of my head. How big were these cities population-wise? I don't really have an answer to that. They're talking about that a little bit in the chat. But
they're normally pretty massive.
Compare it to a European city at the time.
Well, Tenochtitlan would have been bigger than any city in Spain. Like when Cortez got there, he was like, Jesus Christ. It was enormous, and they couldn't figure out how they fed everyone. And then same thing happened in Cusco, and the same thing happened when they met the Tarascans, or when they went to Mississippi. Like Mississippi.
Cahokia.
Cahokia, yeah.
It was pretty big. Yeah.
Thing is, like the Americas weren't, like Europe is kind of more designed for everything to spread out because you have horses and the land is kind of more flat. You have much more rivers. And then the Americas, like especially like South America, is more mountainous and more jungles. Central America is kind of swamps and jungles. So you'd have these massive cities surrounded by just kind of nothing, and then another massive city, and then another massive city.
You also have to take into account that in Europe, cities didn't have cities in Europe grown in population only because of immigration into the cities for the longest time. Cities in Europe had so many diseases, and you would live so close to animals. And during medieval era, it was completely fine to just throw out your waste out of the window onto the street. And there would be so many diseases that people would it would be normal for people to die. But I'm guessing because in America there weren't so many domesticated animals, you wouldn't live in such close proximity to animals, and you wouldn't develop those diseases, and they were able to live in these large cities without having so many deaths like big cities in Europe.
Perhaps, yeah.
And also about the spread of disease in America, I wanted to say that if you want a good idea of a well-accounted disease spread, wouldn't the Black Plague be kind of similar to what happened in America, like in Europe? And we have many accounts of how that spread and how it worked, and that was quick. That spread through Europe in a year or so, and then there were like waves of it. So you would every like 10 years there would be like a sudden emergence again, and then it would die down and then sudden emergence again. And I guess that would be similar to how the disease spread in America. It would be this huge aggressive first wave, and then it would probably be smaller waves after that.
Yeah, I think I've been reading about the Chinookan people here in Oregon, and I think the thinking, according to the book I've read, that there was sort of 3 waves of smallpox and measles. The first sort of happened in the 16th century, before they had any contact with Europeans. Another one towards the end of the 18th century, and then another one sort of in like 1830, which so it did sort of, as you say, come in different waves. It wasn't just, in just one fell swoop, 90% of people dead in a short space of time. These things happened in wave. Obviously, a comparatively short period of time for 90% of the people to die, but it did definitely come and go throughout history.
I mean, it was 90% over 100 years.
Okay.
So by 1600. So that definitely gives you plenty of time for waves, and that's also 3 or 4 generations, depending on how you count. So it is still a long time, but also, as you said, comparatively short.
Mm.
And what you mentioned earlier, knowing better about how the Europeans who arrived after the apocalyptic events due to disease to the natives, they're like, oh yeah, see, God opened up this land for us. We're the chosen people, and clearly we're better because we didn't die from those diseases. And so that just further, I think, made this superiority complex just get worse. And I think a lot of you look at the early slave trade as opposed to later on, how society, like, it kind of just slowly became more racist, like in terms of like, okay, we're in this category, those people are in that category, those people are in that category. Like looking at how the decision was made to have Africans be slaves as opposed to Native Americans. I think this had huge implications that carries over today, which I think also explains why there is still that much hatred towards Columbus, because of the racism that it was always attributed to him. That, of course, as we talked about earlier, you can't blame it all on him, but what happened afterwards. What do you guys think about that aspect in particular?
Don't rush to answer everyone at once.
I wanted to give someone else a chance, but I mean, the decision to use African people as slaves instead of natives was mostly based on the fact that they wouldn't die from the diseases.
Right.
So, like, let's bring these people over because they're already toughened up against these diseases. and they look different, so we can tell who they are. Kind of. I mean, that's the truth of it.
Yeah, as I understand it, it sort of formed out of like a practical decision, and then over generations of people, getting used to, all slaves coming from Africa and stuff like that, that kind of developed into racist ideology. Though I could certainly be mistaken.
No, that's my understanding as well.
Yeah.
And I think it's always fascinating to me how you have essentially, well, kind of like we were talking about early on in this conversation, is when you have people not getting out of their home country, home area, and they're getting out in the world, and they're saying, oh, there's other groups of people out there. But because of that, you're also seeing more racism, because people are like, look how different these people are. They're not the same religion. They're not the same skin color. And so that actually makes it so much worse. Today, I think we're seeing kind of a revert. Like, you think about trends today as far as migration and the internet, the transfer of ideas so quickly. I think you look at a city like New York City, where there's people of all backgrounds all coming to one place, and I think you're seeing kind of like a reverse of that. Like, oh, I'm around different types of people all the time, and so I'm less likely to have racist ideas pop in my head. Whereas, for the first time, people getting out of their home countries back then, 1500s, 1600s, this is when it was created. Like, oh yeah, let's put some people in different categories and justify it because of the fact that, oh yeah, these people died. These people are clearly savages because they don't have the same religion as us. So,
no, and we had touched on this a few times already, where white people were showing up, and there was either nobody there, and the people who were there hadn't domesticated animals. They didn't have the wheel, which, I've tried to approach it from the other side, that they didn't have access to these things, but the Europeans saw it as, these are primitive people who don't have the wheel. Clearly, we must educate them. This is our burden and such. So I think that plays into it a lot, especially when we've been seeing in the chat this entire time, people calling them savages and stuff like that. Yeah. Looking at the chat sometimes is kind of depressing. But it comes from, 300 years ago, people showing up and being like, they don't have the wheel even. How is that? So I don't know if the religion aspect, I'm sure that's how they justified it in their heads. But I don't know if that played as much of a role as just, they don't have like wheat. What's going on here? Like they just,
Yeah.
The
religion, they wrote down that the religion was the main reason. They're like, oh, they're adulterous, but like it was not the actual reason. It's just good PR, good optics.
It's just they needed some kind of a subjugation, some kind of a claim. Yeah, Casas, exactly. They needed Casas Belli and EU4 to do something, because it's like Romans are notorious for this. They would just make up the most weirdest claims to attack people, and then present it to the Senate, or later when there wasn't Senate, present it to the people, and everybody would be like, "Yep, seems good, yeah," even though it was like far from the truth. And I feel like that's what happened here. It's just people trying to make a claim and being like, "Look at this. This clearly means we have to subjugate them, we have to attack them, or conquer this area for us." So it was just a claim. It was just Casas Belli.
Well,
not to get us. Oh, sorry. Not to get us too off track here, but I did write a paper about this time last year that was solely dedicated to all the like crazy reasons that the Romans came up with for it's always they're never invading anywhere, they're never conquering. It's always we're just defending our allies and happening
Yeah.
to completely subjugate the area.
Or even, I know I can't remember when, but I remember there was a count where Romans were like, oh, look, we have to attack there because they attacked our allies over there. And those people that they said were their allies were like, we're not your allies. What are you talking about? Oh, yeah, no, too bad. We already attacked. Sorry.
Well, attack now, justify later. I think every nation kind of, and like when we were discussing earlier how we were taught about Columbus, or I think, like Stefan, like what you were telling me about how you learned about history and growing up in the UK. I mean, goodness, like to completely ignore all the atrocities, like, or just to downplay it. I mean, the United States has been, that's pretty normal, I guess, here. But I mean, I guess like I thought that the UK was more advanced in terms of like admitting mistakes in their curriculum.
I don't know. There's how it works in the UK. Organizations like Cambridge publish different courses, and it's up to the school or the local authority to pick the ones that they want to do. My local area did not cover anything to do with British imperialism, really, or anything like that. And even today, if you bring up the empire and its legacy, and I actually got into an argument with someone in the comments underneath an Epimetheus video, saying that it was wrong for Britain to invade this African country and that was an immoral act. And I got shouted down by a bunch of comments saying anyone would have done the same if the situation was reversed. I mean, those sorts of things, but which, going way back to the earlier point, is why I'm so in favor of some form of Indigenous Peoples Day, just because I think the West really needs to reflect on that. I think Germany does it very well with their notorious history. For example, they lowered their flags to half-mast in Poland on the anniversary of the invasion of Poland. And, should the British make some sort of acknowledgement on Indian Independence Day? I don't know. These are all difficult questions, but
I don't know if England had to do like a lower the mast for every Independence Day. The flag would always be at half mast.
That's true. Yeah, probably. Yeah.
But UK's colonialism is so weird because with German history, you oftentimes have them as the aggressor. So it's kind of clear to be like, okay, you were the bad guys, and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, we were. It's like easier to admit that, but in British colonialism, there's lots of gray areas, and even to this day, they still have the somewhat Commonwealth doing the Commonwealth Games and stuff, and it's with countries that aren't under them, but they're part of the Commonwealth, and that means they have like some sort of trade deals and stuff like that. And that is the remnants of British colonialism. And you could argue that the Commonwealth today is actually a good thing because it's like a small UN, I guess, to a certain extent. And since that is the remnants of British colonialism, you have people arguing like, well, look what it came to be, though. Like, isn't this a good thing? And there's lots of stuff like that you can point to in British colonialism where you could argue that there were good things that came out of it, even though most of it was just started with malice intent.
See, that really annoys me. The people, there's so many people online that say, well, the world was better off thanks to the British Empire. It's a net positive. And it's easy to say that now because, like, well, okay, look at all the good things that Western civilization is better for the world. Like, I think that they kind of lose sight of. I mean, this is also the Columbus discussion. Like, well, we were better off that Columbus went on his missions, and I think are we? I mean, do we really know? Of course, we don't really know. Like, it's of course, the big what if. I mean, if to just confidently say that we're better off, I think is a bit naive just to say that, because like you're making a lot of assumptions there, and
yeah, there's no control Earth where no
Yeah.
colonialism happened that we can
Well, maybe
compare.
we are the control Earth.
well, this is a simulation.
We're failing the test pretty badly. But I think it's hard to talk about the benefits of it when, especially if you were to talk about it to someone whose country or people were the victim of colonialism, because they were dragged, whatever the result is now, they were dragged into that against their will, and
it's the same issue with dropping the atomic bombs. Like people want to have the discussion of, well, was it right? Should we have blah blah blah? And it's similar to colonialism in the fact that, well, we did it. You can't take it back, and we can sit here and debate it. I suppose I find it to be a silly debate because it's not like we can change it, and we don't know what would have happened had it not occurred. So I think colonialism was just sort of the natural progression of what would have happened. And any country who was like, oh, well, we're not going to participate in that, ended up not being a superpower.
Austria-Hungary.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly my thoughts. Austria-Hungary, Sweden.
Yeah.
Although they were more like, we're not going to participate. It's more like, oh yeah, that thing happened. We should have got on that. Well, too late now.
They tried. They had a trading company for a couple of years. Didn't work out.
Yeah.
Their mistake was starting with the Balkans. It's too contentious.
Yeah.
But,
I saw a few comments in the chat of people wanting us to discuss more of the actual story of Columbus and the sources involved. I don't know if I feel like we're all sitting here in agreement about a lot of these things, so we're not really, like, we just kind of accept that, say, Las Casas was full of crap, whereas people in the chat may not necessarily know that, or why, perhaps. So if we could turn the discussion back towards Columbus.
Well, you got into some trouble with. I remember before you even made that Columbus video, you were translating old things, and you were using Google Translate. And I'm just like, well, be a little careful because people are probably going to call you out on using Google Translate.
Yes. And that's, of course, the one thing everyone picks at in that video. And to your credit, it is the one thing you said I should cut out. And I was like, well, no, it's important. And yeah, I should have set it up better, the Google Translate part. I probably would have still done it, but I should have set it up better. What I wanted to do was, so a lot of people, there's like 3 or 4 quotes that everyone throws out when they're trying to trash talk Columbus. So what I wanted to do is take a quote. I think one of them was, I could conquer them with 50 people and govern them as I please. Like, that's one of the quotes that people use to bash Columbus. So I took that, I went to the original Spanish that he spoke, and I put it in Google Translate just to see what the words were. Not to be like, well, their translation is incorrect. No, I just put it in there to see what the words were. And then immediately after that, I go to a different translation of the same quote where he says I could subjugate them. He doesn't say anything about conquer them and govern them as I please. Someone took the Spanish and made it worse. than this other person who took the Spanish and made it actually more correct to what Google Translate says the individual words mean. So that was the point of using Google Translate, was to say, here's two translations of the same text. Which one is more correct? Well, Google Translate says these words mean these things, so it's this one, I think. So yes, I get a lot of flack for the Google Translate part because I didn't set it up well. But the point was that he didn't speak English, and people translate what he had to say differently to suit their needs, I suppose.
To talk about that, first I want to say we should totally do a live stream about stuff what we put in our videos we shouldn't have, like the Google Translate. But then what I wanted to talk about is that lots of times in history, when you quote stuff, people don't realize when history books are written, there's oftentimes a meaning that goes with like the entire chapter or entire page. Like there's history books are written in a way where like, okay, this is kind of the meaning or of the paragraph or of the chapter, and then we're going to give out details, which are going to be the quotes and stuff like that. But you have to take them in the context of that meaning that was presented. And since you are not reading the page, you're not reading that chapter that quote or that line was presented in, you oftentimes lose that meaning. And for example, I read that part which is quoted a lot by people, where Columbus says, "I subjugated and I conquered these people." And even when you go with the bad translation of conquering, the whole tone of that page was more of like, oh, this is like a thought I had, this could be done, but it's not like I'm gonna like capitalize on it. It's not anything. It's literally just like, oh, this could be done, happen, or anything, but I'm not gonna pursue it. I'm not gonna do anything about it at the moment. It's just like this thing I'm gonna write down in my journal.
Yeah, that was one of the points I made in the video. That specific quote, the "with 50 people you could subjugate them," blah blah blah, was part of a letter he was writing to the king and queen, saying, like, I show it on screen, but it was part of a list of like, what would you like for me to do with the native people? Would you like me to bring them back? Would you like me to leave 50 people here to hold a fort? Would you like me to conquer all of it? It was part of a list of things, of suggestions perhaps, and people just take that and they're like, haha, he said we could do this. Another quote that they do this with is, he sold sex slaves as young as 9 years old. And when I was researching that video, I kept seeing that 9 years old part, and I was like, why does everyone keep, like, that's a weird age to just like pin. And I looked it up, and of course, and I find where the quote comes from, and it was part of a letter he wrote complaining about sex slavery, where girls as young as 9 years old were being sold into sexual slavery. And the very next sentence is, this sets a bad example for the present and the future. But they cut that part out, and it's just the sex slave part. And it's like the worst out of context stuff. But since it's someone from 500 years ago, no one like thinks to double check, I guess, or
yeah, they just repeat the out of context stuff over and over and over. And then I guess because it's a lot of work, I don't know.
People don't bother to double check a lot. It happens in everything. Lots of my videos end up being me just diving deeper and deeper into sources because it would just be quotes or stuff. And I'm like, okay, but did it really happen that way? Or is that really like exactly what they meant? And it's frustrating when you're researching.
And as I recall, wasn't there like there was some line about from Columbus's journals about like they would make good servants or something, and wasn't that the one that like it wasn't even the full sentence? It was like began earlier, ended later.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was one of the first, one of like the 3 or 4 quotes that I looked at. But yeah, Cracked showed it like the people are intelligent and would make good servants, and it wasn't the beginning of the sentence, it wasn't the end, it was part of a longer section where he's like, these people have good wit and they learn language quick, they would be good Christians, etc., etc., but they just take the good servant part out because of course it sounds terrible. And it was someone had mentioned this in the chat also. It was part of Black legend. The English were taking Columbus's stuff and translating it in the worst possible way to make the Spanish look worse. That was the point of Black legend. Similarly, that's why you think Napoleon is short. It's an English propaganda campaign. So a lot of the stuff that we know about Columbus was intentionally made to look evil 200 years ago or however long ago it was.
Yeah, revisionist history. I mean, it's which sometimes is what we really need, but a lot of times it's used because people have an agenda.
Well, the context got important as well because, well, he did write in the journal that maybe he meant that they would make good Christian servants. On his second voyage over, he didn't bring like an army of priests. He brought heavy infantry and cavalry and attack dogs and more settlers. So
The
maybe
context.
he did mean that they could make good Christian servants, but that's not what we're going to do with them.
Yeah,
Fair
just to
point.
go off those journals too is pretty. Like as far as what we know about Columbus's life as a whole, what kind of other evidence is out there? We should probably bring up other evidence.
There's writings by his son, which I read. It's the life of Admiral Christopher Columbus by his son Ferdinand. That's what it's called. I don't know how accurate they are, but when I read them, they seem pretty accurate and they seem to go with other sources I know about Columbus. But again, as when you're reading any kind of historical source, you have to take into account the biases and you have to take into account the tone behind the writings a lot. And there's clearly some stuff where you're like, oh, okay, that probably didn't happen. That seems far-fetched. But overall, it seemed like a good source to me.
Someone just said in the comments, did he just say revisionist and like is needed? Like what I meant by that, let me clarify, is that we need to reevaluate history. It's okay when you have new evidence or you have fresh eyes on old evidence to analyze it again. Yes, that's what historians do. So that's what I meant, buddy.
Well, yeah, if you don't have revisionist history, then you'd still be teaching in class that Romulus and Remus built 2 big walls and one jumped over the other and he killed them, and that's how they made Rome.
Yeah.
That works until you have more evidence and you change.
Yeah. I mean, back to Christopher Columbus. Don't people accuse him of not being from Genoa in Italy as well? I was reading about that before the chat.
There's debates about it, that he's from other areas like maybe Savoy or even like Spain or Portugal, but from what I see, that they're very like vague, and the best sources we have say he's from Genoa. So
yeah, I mean, the article I was reading, it was sort of a criticism of people that say he wasn't from Genoa, and the argument that they use is that he never wrote in Italian or their dialect of Italian, and they say he was from Catalonia, but he didn't write in Catalan either. So what's the, he wrote in Spanish. Not everyone went to school in that time. Did anyone write in a Genoese Italian in that time?
we know he spoke many languages anyways. We know he spoke Portuguese, we know he spoke Spanish, Castilian, we know he may have even spoken Catalanian and Italian Genoese, and he may have even known Latin, maybe. I'm not sure, but we do know for sure that he spoke many languages. And so what he writes in, for example, I speak 3 languages, but you will not find a writing of me in Czech ever, even though I can speak it. So I feel like that's kind of like saying, like, okay, yeah, he can speak it, but why? The fact that you didn't find a writing in it doesn't mean he cannot speak it.
Yeah.
And he was hired by the Spanish, so
Exactly.
it would make sense that he would write his reports and such in Spanish.
Yeah.
So.
Also, maybe because we were talking about like how not bad he was, to say how bad he was. When he sent that letter to Spain, to the Queen of Spain and the King of Aragon, I think, he basically asked them like, what should I do? Should I subjugate him, whatever? And they said like, no, be nice to the locals. That's basically the basic gist of what they said. And he kind of wasn't. Like, he ended up being like, nah, no, I'm not. I'm just gonna use everybody here to try to get rich, since he had that 10% of everything that was going to, and he had to pay his fund. He had to pay his investors, so he kind of ended up not doing that, and that's partly why he ended up being not the governor of Hispaniola later on. And that was part of why the Spanish crown decided to be like, you know what, you're not that great. You don't listen to orders very well. And
are you saying he acted in his own self-interest?
Yeah, right. What? And
you just brought up a fairly good point. He was removed as governor in 1499 or 1500.
he was imprisoned in 1500. I think he was removed in
for
1499.
like 3 weeks.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, well, that imprisonment is yes, he was imprisoned for a little while, but that imprisonment is important because that was when they revoked his 10% of like all the revenue, and also he was supposed to have him and in perpetuity, so also his sons, and they actually went to court with the Spanish crown in the 16th century over it. And so that's why the imprisonment was important, since he lost that, and he also lost his title, which was like the Admiral of the Seas or something.
Yeah, Admiral of the Ocean Sea.
Yeah.
They gave it all back to him, though, and sent him out on another voyage.
Although I'm pretty sure they didn't bring back the 10%. That they just took that and they never gave it back, and that's why there was court cases later on with his sons.
I think, yeah, there was a monetary issue. I don't know the specifics of it, but I do know that he was imprisoned for 3 weeks or something very short, like super short. And then he was given everything back and sent out again. So the imprisonment comes up a lot when people are talking about his mistreatment of the natives. And that's not what he was imprisoned for. He was imprisoned for mismanagement of the colonies, as we discussed earlier. He wasn't a very good administrator, and he wasn't extracting enough wealth, so they imprisoned him for a comically short amount of time and then sent him back out again. But
also, there's like intrigue that he was probably like plotted against with the Spanish in Hispaniola that didn't like him so much, so that might have...
Yeah, there was a little bit of That's another piece of why Columbus is demonized, is the reports that we have of him being this awful person come from people who specifically wanted him to lose his title. Like, they were writing stuff about how terrible he was in order to get him out. So they're gonna embellish, maybe lie. They're not like concrete sources. Surely he was awful, right? But the writings at the time from like, I want to say Bobadillo, whoever was next.
Something with a B, I think.
Yeah, it was. They made him seem super terrible on purpose. There was a political agenda. This is like trying to figure out whether Clinton was good or bad by looking at what Trump says. Like, you're gonna get a very skewed version
Opinion.
by doing
Yeah.
that.
Well, we've got just a few minutes here. We better wrap this up. I have a
Okay.
Renaissance festival to go to. I'm so sorry. So I think maybe final thoughts, and also just kind of like maybe give another shout out to your channel, promote your stuff. Whoever wants to go first, and we'll wrap this up. Let's start with Coquito.
Okay. Well,
Donald.
for finishing comments on Columbus, he's kind of just like a damp rag in history, where like, yeah, he did a good thing, and then the rest of him is kind of meh. He's just very complicated, and the things around him are way too complicated to kind of teach in a school setting fairly quickly. But he's like the perfect gray area of history. Maybe actually that you can use him for that. You can use him to teach like gray areas. But if you want to see anything else from me, you can go to Cogito. My channel's there. I do cartoon history videos, and also every Thursday on Kings and Generals.
Right. How
He
about
sold his soul. Continue.
all right? How about Jack?
Let's see. Closing thoughts on Columbus. I think I certainly, don't think that anyone can say that he was like a great guy. I think, for his time and in context, I think he wasn't, especially evil compared to his contemporaries or some of the people that followed him in the Americas. I think really the biggest significance that he has is just that he was first. And for my channel, youtube.com/c/Jack Rackham. Silly, sarcastic biographies. I promise biographies can be fun.
Yeah.
Lots of puns, lots of sarcasm, all good stuff.
These videos are fantastic. Looking forward to our collaboration when your things settle down for you in school.
Yeah.
All right, and then knowing better.
So final thoughts. I used to think that Columbus should be taught in the same way, or not taught, but viewed in the same way as someone like Magellan, where he's a discoverer who did a thing. Next, like, we know who Magellan was. We don't talk about the terrible things he did. We don't celebrate him either. There's no Magellan Day. He's just a discoverer who did a thing. But the more I think about it and the more we discuss it, I think Columbus is an interesting case study to talk about the gray areas of good and evil, and how perspectives change over time, and how misinformation from centuries ago can balloon up into what we have today. So I think even if we get rid of Columbus Day, which I think we should, he would still be kind of a central figure in, at least in American schools, much like George Washington and Lincoln and stuff, because he's an interesting person to look at in the historical context and have that discussion of, was he good or bad? Were the things he did important? Because there aren't very many people where you can sit there and say, well, was he first? What does it mean to discover? And stuff like that. These are important discussions to have in a history class, and I can't really think of anyone else who has that kind of context all wrapped into one person. You can, maybe this guy has this aspect, but Columbus has all of it. As for my channel, it's Knowing Better. I do social studies topics, so history, government, psychology, and stuff. So there you go.
All right. Thank you. And M.Laser.
Oh, it's my turn. Yay. I will just say everybody already said pretty much good ending thoughts on Columbus, and I'm just gonna say it's a mixed bag, and just like anything in history, there's more to it than meets the eye, and you'll have to look at the sources, and you have to think for yourself when looking at those sources and come to logical conclusions. And with that said, Columbus was an interesting character, and definitely is on some wide spectrum sometimes in today's contemporary when people talk about him. But overall, he was just like Magellan. We should talk about him like, oh, he did this, but that's about it. That's where it should end. Unless you're a historian and doing a thesis on him or something. And about my channel, I would say it's M.Laser. I do a series on cities, history of cities. I also do whatever I feel like history is on. And my next video, I'm almost 70% done animating. I'm a bit sick right now, so it's going slow. But I usually don't talk about my next videos, but I will give you just you guys here on the stream, I will give you some sneak information, and that is, it's about the history of University of Oxford. And I know your first thought is, okay, that's boring, history of a university. But I'm talking about the Oxford intellectual movement. If you don't know what that is, you'll find out. And it's mostly early history. So I'll look at the medieval history of University of Oxford. And without giving it too much away, I will say that medieval towns and cities were known for their law and order. And when you mix university students with that, some crazy stuff happens. So yeah, definitely check that out and see what happens. It's going to be an interesting video when I finish it.
All right, looking forward to it. And last but not least, Stefan.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I think we've covered pretty much everything here. I feel bad for Christopher Columbus's younger brothers. I'm a younger brother. We never get the credit. Shout out to my sister Lucy. But yeah, you can find my channel, Stefan Milo. And my next video is on how long have people lived in America, full stop. When were the first humans in America? Which I sat by a river with in the freezing cold yesterday to film. So they'll be out next week, and check it out.
Awesome. Also looking forward to that. And yeah, just my final thoughts, just briefly, as a educator in public schools in the United States, I think this has been a very valuable discussion, and I think it's helped me going forward with how I'm going to teach Columbus. But just in the past, I've generally taught Columbus in a way that is nuanced, and I've tried to. I've had an activity that I've borrowed. I don't remember where I got it from, but it's basically a Socratic seminar that looks at the question, which is probably a poorly framed question, but was Columbus a hero or a villain? And yeah, that's obviously not the best question, but it always is a rewarding experience for my students, mostly because they always come to the conclusion that it's somewhere in between, and they really do dig deeply through the complexities of his legacy. So on that note, Happy Columbus Day, everybody. Sorry, I wanted to say that at the end. I don't know. It's been great. Been a lot of fun. I'm sorry to those of you who I woke up early, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. And make sure to check out all their channels. And we'll have to do something like this again, like with a different topic. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Definitely,
Yeah,
I'm up
I've
for
enjoyed
it.
it. Yeah.
All right. Until next time, thanks for watching, all of you out there in the world.